Why do you insist on throwing a massive, heavy chunk of metal or plastic when the fish in front of you are exclusively feeding on microscopic bugs? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are breaking down one of the most frustrating paradoxes in all of fishing. You are standing on the bank, the water is boiling with fish, but they refuse to touch your lure. I am going to reveal the harsh truth about why your big baits are failing, and I promise you, this realization will completely change how you approach topwater activity. We are going to expose the real reason why so many anglers get completely skunked during a massive feeding frenzy. Do you still believe that big baits always equal big fish? Let me know right now in the comments, because we are about to tear that old rule completely apart. This topic is incredibly important because it is a scenario every single fisherman faces at some point. You arrive at the water, and an insect hatch is in full swing. For generations, we have been taught that if a fish is actively feeding, it will attack anything that moves. Fishermen are creatures of deeply ingrained habit. We find a heavy lure that worked perfectly 3 years ago, we tie it on, and we blindly cast it thousands of times, expecting the exact same result. We get stuck in a rut. When we see fish splashing, our adrenaline spikes, and our instinct is to throw the biggest, loudest thing we own to get their attention. We do the exact same thing year after year, completely ignoring the visual clues right in front of our eyes. Today, we are unpacking the stubborn mindset that keeps your net dry while the fish are having an absolute feast. Let us start by looking at the stubborn fisherman syndrome. Picture this scene because I know you have been there. It is early morning on your favorite lake. The water is completely slick, like a giant mirror reflecting the trees. Suddenly, you see ripples everywhere. The water is literally boiling with fish. You can hear them sipping and splashing all around you. Your heart starts pounding. You grab your medium-heavy rod, tied with a 3/4 of an ounce spoon or a massive crankbait, and you launch it right into the middle of the activity. You reel it back, expecting a massive strike that will rip the rod right out of your hands. But nothing happens. You cast again, maybe a little faster this time. Still nothing. You start cursing, wondering if the fish have suddenly gone blind. But here is the hard truth, my friend. They are not blind at all. They see your lure perfectly well. They just do not care about it. They are locked onto a massive hatch of tiny, emerging insects. Your giant piece of painted metal crashing through the water looks incredibly unnatural. It is like offering a whole roasted pig to a guy who is trying to eat a single grain of rice. The illusion of the big meal is one of the biggest traps in fishing. Let us talk about the biggest myth we all grew up believing. Big baits catch big fish, period. How many times have you heard your grandfather say that? So, you tie on a massive swim bait or a heavy spoon that weighs over 1 ounce, and you refuse to take it off. You stand there for hours, whipping that heavy chunk of lead and plastic into the water. Your shoulder hurts, your wrist is tired, but you are incredibly stubborn. You tell yourself that the fish are just not hungry right now. But look at the water surface again. The fish are literally stuffing their faces. They are feeding exclusively on tiny emerging insects that are smaller than a matchstick head. When a fish locks onto a hatch of insects, it develops extreme tunnel vision. It is no longer looking for a chaotic, fleeing baitfish. It is slowly cruising the surface, opening its mouth, and gulping down thousands of tiny bugs. Your huge, heavy lure is completely out of place in this scenario. The fish will literally swim right past your expensive, heavy lure to eat a bug the size of a grain of sand. The illusion of the big meal is ruining your day on the water, and it is time to wake up. Here is the visual of a perfect morning hatch. It is exactly 6 in the morning. The air is cool, and there is a thin layer of mist hovering right over the water. Everything is dead quiet. Then you start hearing it. Gentle sips. Plop, plop. It sounds like someone is dropping tiny pebbles into the water. You look out and see hundreds of small rings expanding on the surface. The fish are actively feeding. What do? You grab your stiffest rod, rear back, and launch a heavy crankbait straight into the middle of those delicate rings. Smash! Your lure hits the water like a bowling ball falling from the sky. Instantly, all the sipping stops. The rings disappear. The water goes completely dead. You just spooked every single fish in a 50-foot radius. They were focused on delicate, quiet insects landing on the surface. Your heavy lure did not look like a meal to them. It looked and sounded like a massive predator crashing into their dining room. You have to match the mood of the water, not just the food. Next time you are out there in the morning, pay close attention to how much noise you are making. The sound of failure is always a loud splash during a quiet hatch. Let us dive into the biology of the hatch and why fish behave this way. It all comes down to energy expenditure. Imagine a trout or a bass sitting in the water. To chase down a fast-moving baitfish or your fast, heavy spinner, that fish has to burn a massive amount of calories. It has to sprint, turn, and fight. Now compare that to an insect hatch. Thousands of helpless little bugs are slowly drifting right into the mouth of the fish. The fish barely has to move its fins. It just tilts its head up, opens its mouth, and gets free protein. Why would a fish burn 100 calories chasing your heavy lure when it can consume 500 calories by simply sipping bugs with absolutely zero effort? This is the lazy predator concept. When food is abundant and incredibly easy to catch, predators will always choose the easy route. They become incredibly selective. If something does not look exactly like the tiny bugs they are currently eating, they will reject it without a second thought. You simply cannot force a fish to chase a heavy lure when it is perfectly happy eating at the all-you-can-eat bug buffet. Now, I can already hear the complaints from the spin fishing guys. You are probably sitting there thinking, well, I do not own a fly rod, so I guess I'm just out of luck. That is absolutely not true. The philosophy of matching the hatch is not exclusive to fly fishermen. You can easily adapt your spinning gear to throw tiny presentations. Have you ever tried using a clear casting bubble? You tie a clear plastic float to the end of your main line, leave a long leader of light fluorocarbon, and tie on a tiny artificial fly or a micro jig at the end. The casting bubble gives you the weight you need to cast 30 or 40 yards, but the presentation that reaches the fish is practically weightless. It mimics the emerging insect perfectly. Stop using the excuse that your gear is too heavy to catch these picky fish. You can bridge the gap between heavy tackle and micro presentations with just a few simple, inexpensive adjustments. It is all about being versatile on the water and recognizing what the fish actually want to eat, rather than forcing them to eat exactly what you want to throw. We need to have a very serious talk about the ego trip of throwing heavy metal. Be honest with yourself for a minute. Why do you truly love throwing those big lures? It is because you want that aggressive, bone-jarring strike. You want the fish to slam the bait so hard that the rod physically rips out of your hands. Throwing big lures makes us feel like big game hunters. We want to dominate the water, but when the fish are quietly sipping tiny insects, your ego is your absolute worst enemy. You have to check your pride at the bank. Fishing is not about forcing your will onto nature. It is about observing nature and fitting smoothly into the puzzle. When you refuse to downsize your lure because you feel like tiny baits are only for beginners, you are only punishing yourself. The fish do not care about your ego. They do not care how expensive your heavy lure is or how cool it looks flashing in the sun. They only care about the tiny insect that is struggling to break through the surface film. Putting your pride in the tackle box is the very first step to becoming a truly successful angler during a difficult hatch. Let us talk about reading the rise forms on the water. This is a crucial skill that most guys completely ignore while they blindly cast their heavy jigs all morning. If you see huge, aggressive splashes with water flying everywhere, the fish are probably chasing terrified bait fish. Go ahead and throw your heavy lures in that situation. But if you see subtle dimples, small bubbles, or quiet swirls on the surface, you are dealing with a completely different situation. Sometimes you will only see the tail or the dorsal fin of the fish slowly breaking the surface. This means they are feeding on tiny bugs just below or right on top of the surface film. They are barely breaking the water tension. If you see this delicate feeding behavior and you decide to throw a 3/4 of an ounce spoon right into the middle of it, you are making a massive mistake. You have to decode the surface of the water before you even make your first cast. The way a fish breaks the surface tells you exactly what they are eating. If the rise is quiet, your presentation needs to be equally quiet and incredibly small. You have to deeply understand the life cycle of an aquatic insect to realize why your heavy lures are completely failing. Bugs live under the rocks for most of their lives as nymphs. Then, when the time is right, they swim up to the surface to hatch. This is called the emerger stage. During this stage, the insect has to break through the surface tension of the water to spread its wings. Surface tension is like a sticky, unbreakable wall for a tiny bug. They get trapped there, struggling wildly to break free. This makes them the absolute easiest possible meal for a fish. The fish know this instinctively. They will line up and systematically eat thousands of these trapped, struggling insects. Now, look closely at your heavy crankbait. It dives down fast and swims with a tight, aggressive wobble. It looks absolutely nothing like a helpless insect trapped in the surface film. It is completely out of context. The fish are looking upward, staring at the ceiling of the water, waiting for a struggling speck of protein. They are not looking down. You have to understand that when fish are keyed in on emergers, they ignore everything else. This brings us perfectly to the mistake of working the completely wrong water column. I see this specific mistake happen all the time on the lake. A guy is standing on the shore, casting a heavy lead jig, letting it sink all the way to the rocky bottom and slowly bouncing it back. Meanwhile, the fish are feeding exclusively on the top 1 millimeter of the water. This is the ultimate depth disconnect. You could honestly have the best lure in the world, painted in the best color, tied with the strongest knot. But if you are fishing 20 feet below the fish, you are not going to catch a single thing. When insects are hatching, the active feeding zone is incredibly narrow. It is often just an inch below the surface or floating right on top. Heavy lures are mathematically designed to sink. They are designed to get down deep quickly. By their very nature, they pull your presentation completely out of the strike zone almost instantly. You are literally spending 99% of your retrieve in dead water. You have to keep your bait in the zone where the fish are actively looking, and heavy lures make that practically impossible. During an insect hatch, you must realize that color and silhouette matter vastly more than aggressive action. When you throw a heavy, flashing spoon, it relies heavily on underwater vibration and bright flashes of light to trigger a pure reaction strike. But fish feeding on tiny bugs are not reacting out of anger or survival instinct. They are inspecting their food very carefully. They are looking for a specific shape, a specific tiny size, and a specific dark color. Your giant silver spoon looks like an alien spaceship flying recklessly through their living room. It does not look anything like their natural food. When fish are in this highly selective feeding mode, you need a lure that has a tiny, muted silhouette. You want dark colors like brown, olive, or black that accurately mimic the natural tones of a real insect. You absolutely do not want crazy rattles or blinding silver flash. You just want a tiny speck that drifts naturally with the water current. The alien invasion of loud, heavy, flashy lures will only make the fish lock their jaws. You must tone down your entire presentation to fool them. Let us focus strictly on stealth and presentation for a moment. Think about how a natural insect actually enters the water. It lands like a tiny feather. There is absolutely no sound, no giant splash, no heavy vibration ripping through the water column. Now think about your heavy lure. When you cast a solid 1-ounce bait, it lands exactly like a brick. We call this the bomb in the bathtub effect. If you drop a literal bomb in a bathtub, everything in that tub is going to scatter in pure terror. That is exactly what happens to a highly focused school of feeding fish when your heavy lure crashes down directly on their heads. They immediately associate that loud splash with extreme danger, not with a free meal. Even if your lure happens to look somewhat realistic underwater, the terrifying entry has already ruined your chances completely. The fish are now on high alert. Their survival instinct takes over, and feeding becomes secondary. To succeed during a hatch, your presentation must be stealthy. If your cast sounds like someone threw a baseball into the lake, you desperately need to change your approach. So, how do you actually fix this massive problem? You have to aggressively scale down your entire gear setup. Scaling down for success is the absolute only way to beat a tough, selective insect hatch. If you are using heavy braided line connected to a thick steel leader, you are already losing the battle before you cast. Fish that are inspecting tiny insects have plenty of time to see your thick, unnatural line floating there. You need to immediately switch to very light fluorocarbon leader material. We are talking 4-pound or even 2-pound test line. This incredibly thin line is practically invisible underwater and allows tiny baits to move naturally with the current. Next, you need to tie on the absolute smallest jig or artificial fly you can possibly find in your box. A 1/32nd or 1/64th of an ounce micro jig paired with a tiny piece of black plastic is deadly in these exact situations. Yes, it is very hard to cast far. Yes, it requires a lot of patience. But when the fish are exclusively eating things the size of a mosquito, downsizing your entire presentation is absolutely necessary. There is a very deep psychology behind the feeding frenzy that you need to completely grasp to be successful. When fish are gorging on a massive hatch, they enter a very specific, almost hypnotic rhythmic feeding state. They rise, sip, sink, and repeat. Rise, sip, sink, repeat. It is a highly efficient cycle of eating. They become completely mesmerized by this rhythm. They literally lock their brains onto the exact size and shape of the bugs that are most abundant right then. Biologists call this a search image. Anything that does not fit that specific search image is completely and totally ignored. When you throw a heavy, fast-moving lure right through the middle of this delicate rhythm, you are breaking the cycle in the worst way possible. The fish look at your lure and their brain simply says, "That is definitely not a bug." They do not view it as a bonus meal. They view it as a terrifying anomaly. To catch fish in this state, your bait needs to drift exactly like the real bugs, at the exact same speed. You must seamlessly become part of their natural rhythm. Picture the highly frustrating neighbor on the bank. You know exactly who I am talking about. You are standing there, casting your heavy lures until your right arm literally falls off, without getting a single bite. But 50 yards down the bank, there is a quiet guy who is hooking a beautiful fish on almost every single cast. What on earth is he doing differently? He is definitely not casting blindly. Before he even rigged his rod, he sat down on the bank and watched the water closely for 10 full minutes. He actively observed what the fish were eating. He reached out and scooped a real bug out of the water to look at its exact size and color. Then, and only then, he tied on a tiny presentation that matched it perfectly. He is fishing smart, while you are just fishing hard. Learning from the quiet guy is the best thing you can possibly do for your fishing career. Stop assuming that the fish are just inactive simply because they are not hitting your heavy lures. Assume that you are doing something completely wrong, and actively look around for clues. We also deeply need to consider the weather factor and how it naturally triggers these massive insect hatches. Have you ever noticed that the best hatches often happen on gloomy, overcast days, or during a very slight, steady drizzle? The heavy cloud cover actively protects the delicate emerging insects from the harsh, burning sun, making them feel incredibly safe to hatch in massive, overwhelming numbers. On these dark, cloudy days, many traditional fishermen assume they desperately need a loud, heavy, vibrating lure to help the fish find their bait in the low-light conditions. This is a massive, fundamental miscalculation. The fish do not need any help finding food on these specific days because the surface is literally covered in millions of natural insects. Your loud, sunny day tactics will fail miserably right here. The gloomy weather is the absolute perfect storm for a hatch, and you uniquely need to adapt to the tiny bugs, not the dark clouds. Always let the actual behavior of the feeding fish dictate your specific lure choice, not just the weather forecast on your phone. Let us be brutally honest about the massive tackle industry trap for a second. The modern fishing industry is scientifically designed to sell you more lures. They consistently design massive, highly realistic, beautiful lures with crazy, erratic swimming action because those exact lures catch the fisherman walking in the store. They look absolutely incredible hanging right there on the pegboard under the bright lights. You buy that heavy $20 swim bait and you instantly feel completely obligated to throw it all day long, just to justify the high cost. The marketing illusion actively tells you that the biggest, baddest lure will always catch the biggest, baddest fish. But Mother Nature does not care about clever marketing. A 10-pound trout or a massive bass will happily spend 3 straight hours sipping microscopic bugs off the surface, if that is what is most energy efficient. The fish do not watch fishing commercials on television. Trust the pure biology of the animal over the flashy marketing of the industry. But what if you are completely stranded out there? What if you only brought one heavy rod and a heavy box full of heavy lures, and you suddenly find yourself completely surrounded by a massive insect hatch? This is exactly where desperate adaptation beautifully comes into play. You have to radically modify your heavy gear on the spot. Instead of tying your heavy spoon directly to the very end of the line, try tying a simple dropper loop about 2 feet above the heavy lure. On that specific dropper loop, tie on a tiny bare hook with a small piece of dark plastic, or even a little bit of fuzz from your own shirt. Now, cast your heavy lure out there and reel it in incredibly slowly. The heavy lure simply acts as a necessary casting weight, while the tiny hook right above it brilliantly mimics the emerging insect. It is certainly not perfect, and it is very far from stealthy, but it is 1,000 times better than blindly hoping a highly selective fish will randomly attack your giant, heavy spoon. Never let sheer stubbornness stop you from trying a wild modification. Understanding the vital transition period is another crucial piece of this complex puzzle. An intense insect hatch absolutely does not last forever. It might last for 20 fast minutes, or it might last for 2 solid hours. During this specific window of time, you must fully commit to throwing tiny presentations. But you also have to pay very close attention to exactly when the hatch finally ends. Suddenly, the expanding rings on the water will disappear. The gentle sipping sounds will completely stop. The remaining tiny bugs will either fly away or get blown directly into the bank. This is the dramatic shift in appetite. The fish will quickly drop back down into deeper water, and their extreme tunnel vision will slowly fade away entirely. Now, they are finally back to hunting much larger prey. This is the exact moment when you can finally cut off that tiny micro jig and confidently tie your heavy lure right back on. Timing is absolutely everything on the water. You have to ride the natural wave of the hatch. There is an absolutely incredible sense of personal satisfaction that deeply comes with finally solving this specific puzzle. I want you to truly imagine the feeling. You have been standing there for a full hour, aggressively throwing your heavy metal spoon, getting completely ignored, while big fish physically jump all around you. Your deep frustration is peaking, but then you take a very deep breath. You sit down, firmly cut off that 1-ounce piece of useless metal and tie on a long, clear leader with a tiny, practically weightless artificial bug. You cast it gently out there. It lands incredibly softly on the surface. You absolutely do not reel. You just let it sit there and drift completely naturally. Suddenly, a massive dark shadow slowly rises from the deep depths. It tilts its big head, opens its mouth, and quietly sips your tiny lure right under the water. You aggressively set the hook, and the water heavily explodes. The incredibly sweet taste of pure victory washes completely over you. This is the true essence of total angling mastery. It is finally time to totally redefine what exactly makes a truly successful angler out there on the water. It is absolutely not about who has the biggest tackle box, the heaviest stiff rods, or the most wildly expensive lures in their boat. The ultimate lesson here is that a great fisherman is incredibly observant and relentlessly adaptable to any situation. When you arrive at the water and clearly see fish feeding exclusively on tiny emerging insects, you deeply have to respect the situation. Leave your massive ego right there in the truck, put away the heavy lures that crash violently into the water and loudly spook everything in sight. Take the time to properly scale down your fishing line, perfectly match the tiny size and dark color of the natural food, and present your bait with absolute, perfect stealth. Fishing is a constant, ongoing conversation with wild nature. Listen closely to the water. Actively adapt your approach. Fearlessly downsize your presentation. I fully promise you, your catch rate will absolutely skyrocket. To wrap things up, the secret to successfully fishing during an intense insect hatch is entirely about dropping your ego and paying incredibly close attention to the tiny details. The biggest turning point is simply realizing that the absolute largest fish in the lake will happily and exclusively feed on the absolute smallest items in the entire food chain. It is a massive twist to everything we learned growing up as fishermen. But when you finally understand the pure energy efficiency of a feeding fish during a hatch, everything instantly clicks into place. This knowledge completely changes your entire approach. You absolutely stop blindly casting heavy metal, and you start actively hunting like a true thinking predator. Thank you so much for watching the video today. If this detailed breakdown helped you understand exactly why your heavy lures are getting completely ignored, please violently hit that subscribe button, carefully smash that like button, and drop a comment right down below. I really want to know, what is the absolute most frustrating insect hatch you have ever tried to fish through? Let us debate it down in the comments, and I will see you out on the water next time.